I will never forget my first visit to Bachelor's Grove Cemetery in Illinois. Established in the early 1800s, this small, abandoned cemetery is notorious for its paranormal activity. As I walked through the overgrown paths, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Locals whispered about the phantom of Bachelor's Grove, a spectre said to roam the grounds. One night, inspired by tales of supernatural encounters and true crime stories, I decided to visit Bachelor's Grove alone. Armed with only my flashlight and camera, I entered the cemetery at dusk. As the light faded, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. I could feel a chill run down my spine, much like the unsettling stories shared on horror podcasts and channels. Suddenly I saw a figure in the distance. At first I thought it was another explorer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a ghostly apparition. It resembled a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her face obscured by shadows. She glided silently among the tombstones, her presence sending waves of fear through me. I managed to capture her on camera, but when I looked back, she had vanished. The footage I took that night became one of the most chilling horror videos on the internet. As I delved deeper into the history of Bachelor's Grove, I learned more about the phantom. Legend has it that she was a woman who lived near the cemetery in the early 1900s. Her husband died under mysterious circumstances, and she visited his grave every day, consumed by grief. One day she vanished without a trace, and her spirit has been seen wandering the cemetery ever since. Her sorrowful wails can be heard on quiet nights, much like the disturbing sounds reported in horror games and movies. The locals also spoke of other supernatural occurrences in Bachelor's Grove. There are tales of phantom cars driving through the cemetery, only to disappear without a trace. Ghostly lights float above the graves, and some visitors have reported being touched by unseen hands. One particularly chilling story involves a group of teenagers who dared each other to spend the night in the cemetery. They set up camp and began telling scary stories to pass the time. As the night wore on, they heard footsteps approaching their tent. They assumed it was one of their friends playing a prank, but when they looked outside, no one was there. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more insistent. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and they saw the phantom of Bachelor's Grove standing at the edge of their campsite. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, and she reached out to them with a ghostly hand. The teenagers fled in terror, leaving behind their belongings. When they returned the next day, their campsite was undisturbed, but the memory of that night haunted them for years. Highgate Cemetery in London is another place shrouded in mystery and supernatural legends. This Victorian cemetery is the final resting place for many famous individuals, but it's also known for its dark, haunting presence. One of the most terrifying stories is that of the Shadow Man, a sinister figure seen lurking among the graves. One evening, I joined a group of paranormal investigators at Highgate. As the sun set, the cemetery transformed into a place straight out of a horror movie. We set up our equipment, including CCTV cameras, hoping to capture any paranormal activity. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence fell over the cemetery. Around midnight, we heard footsteps echoing through the darkness. Our cameras picked up a tall, shadowy figure moving between the tombstones. Its eyes glowed with an eerie red light, much like the entities encountered in horror games. The figure seemed to follow us, always staying just out of reach. We felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if we were being watched by something evil. As we reviewed the footage later, we saw the shadow man clearly. He was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes. He moved with an unnatural grace, his shadowy form blending into the darkness. The investigators believed he was the spirit of a man who had been buried alive in the cemetery. His restless soul now wanders the grounds, seeking revenge on the living. Highgate Cemetery has many other ghostly tales. Visitors often report seeing apparitions of Victorian-era figures, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. Some have heard disembodied voices whispering their names, and others have felt an icy touch on their shoulders. One story involves a woman who visited the cemetery to pay her respects to a deceased relative. As she knelt by the grave, she felt a hand on her back. She turned around, expecting to see another visitor, but no one was there. The woman later learned that she had been touched by the spirit of a former gravedigger. He had died in a tragic accident while working in the cemetery, and his ghost now lingers near the graves. His presence is often accompanied by the sound of shovels digging in the earth, even though no one is around. Another chilling encounter involved a group of friends who decided to explore Highgate at night. They brought along a Ouija board, hoping to communicate with the spirits. As they began their session, the planchette moved on its own, spelling out the name Thomas. The friends felt a sudden chill, and one of them saw a shadowy figure standing nearby. It was the shadow man, watching them with his glowing red eyes. Terrified, they tried to end the session, but the planchette wouldn't stop moving. It spelled out a message: "Leave now." The friends fled the cemetery, leaving the Ouija board behind. They never returned, but their encounter with the shadow man became a popular story among paranormal enthusiasts. Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles is a place where the stars of the past find their eternal rest. But among the famous graves and grand mausoleums, there is a lesser-known spirit that haunts the cemetery, the Lady in Black. The Lady in Black is said to be the ghost of a woman who died under mysterious circumstances in the early 20th century. She is often seen near the graves of silent film stars, dressed in a long black gown with a veil covering her face. Her presence is usually accompanied by the scent of roses, a flower often associated with mourning. One night, I decided to visit Hollywood Forever Cemetery to investigate the legend of the Lady in Black. As I walked through the cemetery, I felt a strange sense of calm despite the eerie atmosphere. The graves of Hollywood legends surrounded me, and the history of the place was palpable. I reached the area where the Lady in Black was most often seen and waited. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the tombstones. As the night wore on, I began to feel a chill in the air. Suddenly I smelled the unmistakable scent of roses. I turned around and saw her, the Lady in Black, standing near a gravestone, her veil blowing gently in the wind. She moved gracefully among the graves, her head bowed as if in mourning. I watched in awe and fear, my heart pounding in my chest. She seemed to be searching for something or someone, her sorrow evident in her every movement. As I tried to get closer, she vanished into the night, leaving behind only the lingering scent of roses. I later learned that the Lady in Black was believed to be the spirit of a woman who'd been engaged to a famous silent film star. Her fiancé died suddenly, and she was so overcome with grief that she visited his grave every day. One day, she too disappeared, and her spirit has been seen wandering the cemetery ever since. Hollywood Forever Cemetery has other ghostly residents as well. Visitors have reported seeing the ghost of Rudolph Valentino, one of the most famous silent film stars. His apparition is often seen near his crypt, dressed in his signature matador costume. Some have even claimed to hear his voice whispering softly in the night. Another well-known spirit is that of Virginia Rupp, an actress who died under suspicious circumstances at a party in 1921. Her death was linked to the scandalous trial of Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, and her spirit is said to haunt the cemetery. Visitors have reported seeing a woman in a white dress crying near her grave. The Lady in Black remains one of the most haunting and mysterious figures in Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Her story is a tragic reminder of love lost and the enduring power of grief. Her ghostly presence continues to captivate and terrify those who encounter her. The Crying Child Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh, Scotland, is known for its dark history and paranormal activity. One of the most unsettling stories involves the ghost of a crying child. This spirit is said to haunt the graveyard, searching for his mother who died during the plague. The first time I visited Greyfriars Kirkyard, I was struck by its eerie beauty. The old, weathered tombstones and mausoleums gave the place a sense of timelessness. But as night fell, the atmosphere grew more sinister. The air was filled with a sense of sorrow and loss, much like the unsettling tales shared on horror podcasts and forums like Reddit horror stories. I had heard about the crying child from locals who spoke of hearing his mournful wails late at night. Determined to capture evidence of the paranormal, I brought my camera and set up near the part of the graveyard where the child was most often seen. As the hours passed, the temperature dropped and a thick fog rolled in. Suddenly I heard it, a faint, heart-wrenching cry. The sound grew louder, echoing through the graveyard. I followed the cries, my flashlight cutting through the fog. I reached a small, neglected grave, and there he was, a young boy, no older than 7, dressed in tattered clothes from centuries past. He was kneeling by the grave, tears streaming down his pale face. He looked up at me with sorrowful eyes, and in that moment I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. The boy reached out his hand, and as I took a step closer, he vanished into the fog. The crying stopped, and I was left alone in the silence of the graveyard. I later learned that the crying child was a victim of the plague that swept through Edinburgh in the 1600s. He and his mother were buried in a mass grave, but his spirit could not rest. He wanders Greyfriars Kirkyard, searching for his mother and crying out in despair. His presence is a chilling reminder of the suffering and loss that the plague brought to the city. Greyfriars Kirkyard is also known for other supernatural occurrences. One of the most famous stories involves the Mackenzie poltergeist, a violent spirit said to attack visitors. The poltergeist is believed to be the restless spirit of Sir George Mackenzie, a ruthless judge who persecuted the Covenanters in the 17th century. Visitors have reported being scratched, pushed, and even knocked unconscious by an unseen force. The Black Mausoleum, where Mackenzie's tomb is located, is the epicenter of the poltergeist activity. Paranormal investigators have captured eerie EVP recordings and strange anomalies on camera. The violent encounters have led some to believe that the poltergeist is seeking revenge for the injustices he inflicted in life. Greyfriars Kirkyard is also home to other ghostly apparitions. Visitors have reported seeing shadowy figures moving among the graves, hearing disembodied voices and feeling sudden drops in temperature. One story involves a woman who visited the graveyard late at night. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder and turned around to see a ghostly figure staring at her. The figure disappeared, but the woman was left with a lasting sense of fear. The crying child and the Mackenzie poltergeist are just two of the many spirits that haunt Greyfriars Kirkyard. The graveyard's dark history and tragic past have left a lasting mark, making it one of the most haunted places in Scotland. The Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Our final story takes us to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in New York, a place made famous by Washington Irving's tale of the Headless Horseman. But this cemetery is not just a literary creation, it is also the site of numerous paranormal encounters. The legend of the Headless Horseman dates back to the American Revolution. According to the story, a Hessian soldier was decapitated by a cannonball and buried in Sleepy Hollow. His restless spirit now roams the cemetery, searching for his lost head. I decided to visit Sleepy Hollow Cemetery on Halloween night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous ghost. The cemetery was bathed in moonlight, and the air was filled with an eerie stillness. As I walked among the graves, I felt a sense of unease, as if I were being watched. Suddenly I heard the sound of galloping hooves. I turned around and saw a shadowy figure on horseback riding through the cemetery at an unnatural speed. The figure had no head, and its horse's eyes glowed with a menacing red light. The Headless Horseman rode past me, disappearing into the night. I managed to capture the apparition on camera, but when I reviewed the footage, the horseman was barely visible, a faint shadow in the darkness. The experience was both thrilling and terrifying, much like the encounters described in the best horror movies and games. Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is also home to other supernatural tales. Visitors have reported seeing ghostly apparitions of Revolutionary War soldiers dressed in tattered uniforms and carrying muskets. Some have heard the sound of drums and gunfire, as if a battle were being reenacted by the spirits of the past. One story involves a man who visited the cemetery to pay his respects to his ancestors. As he walked through the graves, he felt a sudden chill and saw a group of ghostly soldiers marching in formation. The soldiers seemed to be reenacting a battle, their faces filled with determination and fear. The man watched in awe as the spectral scene played out before him, only to vanish moments later. Another chilling encounter involves the ghost of a woman known as the White Lady. She is often seen near the Old Dutch church, dressed in a flowing white gown. Legend has it that she was a bride who died tragically on her wedding day. Her spirit now roams the cemetery, searching for her lost love. One night, a couple visiting the cemetery saw the White Lady standing by a gravestone. She seemed to be weeping, her sorrow palpable in the air. As they approached, she looked up, her eyes filled with sadness. The couple felt a sudden cold breeze, and the White Lady vanished, leaving behind only the scent of lavender. Sleepy Hollow Cemetery's haunted reputation extends beyond the Headless Horseman and the White Lady. Visitors have reported seeing strange lights, hearing disembodied voices, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The cemetery's dark history and connection to Washington Irving's tale have made it a magnet for ghost hunters and supernatural enthusiasts.